I'm chair, Paddy Turner, chair of the National Accosiation of Disability Practitioners. This is an organisation that really is made up of members just like yourselves. So we have 1,500 or so members from right across the UK, and they all work within higher and further education, supporting disabled students. And it's their membership money which keeps us going as an organisation. So we have no funding from government. We are literally a network of people working in the similar positions to you, I imagine. I'm privileged to chair that association. It's become, over the years, been going since about 2000, and I've been chair since 2011. It's my last year, and I should be waving goodbye in next summer with some regret, but with also some relief, because it's hard work, because we're all volunteers who work on the board. And that's how come I have two roles, because the job that pays my wage is a job at Sheffield Hallam University as an education developer. And I'll talk a little bit more deeply about what that role is, but you may be wondering how it is that an education developer working in the centre of the university, supporting the professional development of the teaching staff in the institution, is chair of a National Accosiation of Disability Practitioners. And we go on journeys in our working lives which we can't always predict, and we certainly don't always plan. I started at Sheffield Hallam in 1998 as a sign language interpreter. So I was standing in lectures interpreting for deaf students, so they had access, and we had a lot of deaf students at Sheffield Hallam at the time. And I was also managing the services and training note takers and coordinating the support for all the students, and also then developed into a manager of student services for disabled students, and within that started trying to talk to academic staff. If you don't want to make these changes for disabled students, then why don't you change what you do in advance? Start to develop your learning and teaching to be more inclusive before the year starts, so you don't then have to react and complain about having all these sudden changes that you have to make. And because of that work, I ended up being moved into an academic role in the centre of the university to continue that work from a perspective not from disabled students specifically, but for all students. And that's the inclusive practice agenda. And now I'm doing a lot of work with developing the learning and teaching practice of academics in a whole range of different ways. And one of the things I do, and I'll come on to this a bit later, I'll talk about the consequences of this, but one of the things I'm doing is, I don't know if it's the same here, but I think it is, teachers in higher education are not necessarily taught to teach. They're not necessarily teachers. They're what we call disciplinarians first. They might be architects, engineers, computer technicians, graphic designers first, and then they come into teaching, and they start teaching. And we have two routes towards improving that. One is a taught course, a postgraduate certificate, which at the beginning of their careers, academics can go on and learn for a year, and then they get a postgraduate certificate. And we also have what's called an experiential route, a route to gaining fellowship of the Higher Education Academy, whereby they have to demonstrate that they understand how to teach, they know how to teach, they can talk about the theory and learning of teaching, and that they teach appropriately. And they do that through applying for fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. And I support academic staff through that process. So I get to talk to staff about their practice, day in, day out. What do you do? How do you do it? Why do you do it? And get them to reflect on their learning and teaching. So I get a really good understanding of what makes academics tick right across the institution. And I've also had the experience of being a sign language interpreter, trying to interpret what an academic teaching a subject is delivering to students. So I've experienced being in a lot of different lectures with academics. So I'm beginning to have this really quite extensive experience of both the side of delivering support, inclusive practice, but also the experience of academics. And a bit later on, I want to talk in a bit more depth about what that has taught me and what I've found from that. That's a long introduction. Challenging assumptions, barriers to inclusion. If anyone here has a visual impairment, I will be sipping water, but also making sure that I read everything that's on every slide. Okay, I'm going to give you a bit of context around the UK, because I think it helps to give that. I'm also going to tell you what's happening currently, which Eleanor hinted at. Some of the things that are happening in the sector around developing inclusive practice, and then I'll start to talk about my own reflections on that. So in the UK, we have a thing called the Disabled Students Allowances, or DSAs. They've been going since 1989. Actually, there was a fund called Disabled Students Something Else Award, Disabled Students Award, before that, but in 1989 it became legally enshrined in the law that money would go to the student for them to pay for the support that they needed in higher education. So it was on the basis that a student had additional costs themselves. They had additional costs. And there was no legal requirement on an institution, a university in those days, to provide any support. This is why the student had to pay for it themselves. And they got money to do that. And over the years, that it got bigger and extended and broader. It was not means tested as it was originally. It became open to any age, so there was a cut-off of, I think, about 50. If you were over than 50, you couldn't get it, and then that was removed. And it became a substantial award. So the amount of money that was available, there were 4 awards. There's equipment, non-medical help, i.e. people, personal assistants, mentors, note-takers, interpreters, so on, people to support. That was another award. Another award was a travel award, which would cover taxis, for example. And then there was a kind of general award, which covered the process of assessing the needs, but also other incidental costs. It got to be like potentially about £25,000 a year. So I don't know if you could do a quick translation, but I reckon that's about 250,000 Norwegian kroner, something like that. It's a lot of money, potentially, every year for one student. That would be the maximum. Wasn't actually what most students got. So that's been a very, very important fund over a long period of time for students to access support in higher education. And they were assessed externally from the university sometimes, and that money was made available for them. But this was all prior to the legal framework. And we got our discriminatory law, the Disability Discrimination Act came in 1995, but it didn't cover education. It only covered education in 2001 when it became the Special Educational Needs and Disability Act. And that was what brought in the idea of reasonable adjustments. So you were talking earlier about suitable and reasonable and how you define it, and I had a question. So it wasn't a question actually, it was how we did reasonable and how it worked, and I'm sure it'll be very similar here, that reasonable, there was guidance written as to what was likely to be reasonable. Custom and practice started to define what most people considered reasonable, but ultimately, the only arbiter of what is reasonable or not is a judge in a court of law, based on the guidance and based on what they defined as reasonable. But certainly, it's not for an individual academic or an individual budget holder in a department to say, I can't afford this, this isn't reasonable, or I've got so much work, I haven't got time to make this change. However unreasonable it may feel for that individual or that department, that's not how reasonableness is defined in terms of whether a student can access support or not. So yes, this idea of reasonable adjustments. Universities had to provide reasonable adjustments, and they couldn't charge a student for reasonable adjustments. It was changed to the disability equality duty, or added to, in 2005. And this put a responsibility on the institution to anticipate the needs of disabled people. They couldn't say, oh, a blind student has arrived, I haven't had time to translate all my papers into Braille. I haven't had time. That wasn't good enough. They should have anticipated the potential for a blind student to come and know where to go to get Braille organised and be sufficiently organised to make it happen in the right sort of timescales. So that's what the disability equality duty is kind of enshrined in law. And then all of that was scrapped, and we had the Equality Act in 2010, which brought together all the discrimination acts under what are called protected characteristics, so race, gender, sex, etc., etc., etc. And that's been in place since 2010. What happened was that the... so I'm going to... Because I do have a tendency to talk much too much, I'm going to keep an eye on the time. The government finally caught up, and I don't know if you've spotted this, but the inconsistency between the DSAs and reasonable adjustments. So if a university is required to make reasonable adjustments and not charge the student for them, and those reasonable adjustments include things like providing note takers or personal assistants or equipment, then the DSAs can only pay for an additional cost that the student is obliged to incur. Well, if the university can't charge them for these, then they're not having any costs. So why should they receive DSAs? In 2014, the government suddenly announced that they were going to cut a whole load of the DSA payments because universities should be providing these things as a reasonable adjustment. So they were interpreting the law to say, this is a reasonable adjustment, therefore we will not pay disabled students this money because they're not having to pay for it anymore, because you can't charge them for it anymore. So this came a bit out of a clear blue sky. I don't know if you use that phrase in Norway, but it looks like it's all clear and then suddenly this massive cloud appears. So it was quite a shock, and everyone was scrabbling around madly trying to decide how we were going to implement that, and I won't go into the details of that because it was just a mess. But what it did do was focus the minds of higher education institutions. The positive side of this, let's say, was to focus the minds of higher education institutions on the idea of inclusive practice. Or it focused the minds of the government on focusing the minds of universities to think about inclusive practice. Because if you can be inclusive, true inclusion means you're not providing something different and special and focused and individual for a student specifically, just because they happen to be disabled. A truly inclusive environment means that their needs are catered for within the general approach. That's the idea. So it started this push towards inclusive practices, and the Higher Education Funding Council for England, HEFCE, so this is the body that's charged by the government with everything to do with funding in higher education, they decided to do a piece of research into the gaps in student outcomes. So this is my next slide. They had this research which was the causes of differences in student outcomes. And what they mean by student outcomes is their achievement, what they leave the university with. And what they were discovering was that students would leave the university, the percentage of students leaving the university with a good quality degree, that's a 2-1 or a first-class degree. For some groups, specifically identifiable groups, the percentage was smaller. This was particularly the case with BME students, British and minority ethnic students. It was quite substantially worse. In other words, in theory, there was some way in which our teaching in higher education, was discriminating against students from minority ethnic communities, but also disabled students. Much less so, but certainly disabled students, and particular groups of disabled students as well. And so what they came up with in their report was inclusive practice is fundamental to addressing these outcome gaps for specific groups of students in UK HEIs. So they identified very clearly that inclusive practice is really, really important. And they said, this is a quote from their report, "A central challenge for many institutions is to go beyond piecemeal," that's a phrase that means bitty, little bits of things, and time-constrained projects towards the achievement of widespread cultural change, which extends right across institutions and is embedded at the strategic level as well as in the day-to-day provision of higher education. So they're talking about massive change. They're recognizing that inclusive practice is not just something you do once or twice, or you don't set out to do a project on it and then leave it. This is something that has to continue. At the same time, the government set up a central body, specifically as a result of these changes to the DSAs, and it was called the Disabled Student Sector Leadership Group. Slightly laborious, long title. But it was chaired by a Vice-Chancellor of one of British universities in Wolverhampton, and it was constituted of the major bodies across the range of higher education. So Universities UK, which is the body that is made of all the Vice-Chancellors in the UK, were on that group. The Higher Education Academy, which is responsible for teaching quality across the UK. The Quality Assurance Agency, which is the assurance body for quality across the HEFCE, as I mentioned before, the Higher Education Funding Council, the National Union of Students. They all sat on this group, and their aim of this group, initially was a task and finish group, was to write a report to send to Vice-Chancellors and to the governing bodies of higher education institutions. So this is a report, this is going at the highest level. This is what they recognised was important. We've got to go to the highest level in an institution and advise them, this is what you need to be doing. And NADP had a part in writing part of this work, and this was the stuff that was around inclusive practice. So they said that the introduction and embedding of genuine inclusive practice across a university requires leadership from the top of the HE provider, strong leadership, a focus on this area in the face of competing priorities. In other words, don't just stop doing this because something else comes around that's really important around employability, the next big thing, whatever it might be. Keep focus on it. Understanding that culture change is at the root. Engagement with the concept right across the university. So really they're repeating a lot of what the HEFCE report was saying, as you can see. That there needed some initial resourcing and project planning to engage in the change across the whole provider. So, yeah, there needed to be some, we say, pump priming, initial funding, money right there at the start to say, this has to happen, and here's the resources for it. The time to enact change. It's not going to be simple. We also need to understand how this is working. So if we're making change, is it change that's successful or not? So we need to have methods and processes for evaluating the changes that are put in place. A genuine understanding that goes beyond the idea of this quick fix, this piecemeal change, that it's a project, that there is a long process of sustained engagement. You need to keep, if you like, the pressure on until it becomes culturally embedded. And then genuine support to really engage with staff across the HE provider. Now, those are big things to require or to ask of university vice-chancellors. And this was sent out in about February of this year to every vice-chancellor. So it's far too early for me to say, this has been a fantastic success. This has been amazing. But what I can tell you in our institution is that I don't think it has had much success. I don't think it has made a huge amount of difference. Our university, at the same time as this came out, was going through a complete strategic plan change. You know, new vice-chancellor, new kind of people in at the top across the institution, re-evaluating the institution, deciding to make... you recognise these things? These things happen at your universities on a regular basis. Let's have a new strategic plan. We've got these pillars, these pillars. I don't know what they are. They're pillars that form part of this strategic plan, okay? And in one of those pillars is inclusive practice. Great. But it says focusing on BME students. So straight away that says to me, they don't really understand the meaning of the word inclusive or inclusive, the idea, the principle of inclusion, because they're going to talk about inclusion in relation to BME students, British and minority ethnic students, because that's where, as far as they're concerned, the biggest headline problem is. I know that the person who's responsible for that pillar in our institution doesn't understand what inclusive practice is. And I'm in one of those positions where I have, I can be invited to Norway to speak about inclusive practice. I'm invited to universities across the UK to talk about inclusive practice because of my role in NADP in my own institution. Who? Paddy, who? I don't have the same impact. I'm just someone quite low down the chain. And they're quite happy that, I seem to have a bit of a reputational benefit to the institution, but as far as asking my opinion about something or getting me involved, they don't seem to want to do that. So I know, because we have a board of directors at NADP. They're all senior managers or most of them are senior managers in disability services, and they are finding also that not an enormous amount is happening yet. So we've got this support across the high levels, lots of really good statements, and I have to say that most universities in the UK do have in their mission statements say phrases like, "We believe in inclusion," "We are a truly inclusive institution." But they're not really, not when it comes down to it. What do we mean by inclusion? Here's a definition that comes from Professor Hawkins. She did some work for the Higher Education Academy, and she collated a lot of different work around inclusion, and she came up with this definition. Pedagogy, curricula, and assessment are designed and delivered to engage students in learning that is meaningful, relevant, and accessible to all. So it's quite a broad statement, but it's quite a good one. I mean, I think it's a reasonable approach. It seems to me like something that anyone who has any decent values within them would want to support and agree with. It's just saying everything we do in teaching arena is designed and delivered so that all students can be involved, because why would you want a student not to be? Why would you go into a classroom and think, actually, I don't care about them. I'm just going to teach this one's. Sorry, guys. Well, you wouldn't, would you? No teacher would do that. Actually, if you talk to them, nobody would say they wouldn't want to do that. So this is quite reasonable, I think. It's just good teaching. That's all it is. It's just good teaching. And I've heard that a million times. And inclusive practice is just good teaching practice. Pauline Hainsworth did a lot of work in Scotland and working with the Higher Education Academy. And in 2015, so only a couple of years ago, she did some work on equality and diversity in the curriculum. She identified 4 key underpinning principles for academics. So this is directed at academics. Interrogate your disciplinary norms. What that means is, interrogate, it's like what police do sorry, I'm explaining some words because I don't know if everyone's going to understand. But interrogate, yes. So it's asking people to think about what they do normally within their discipline, within their subject area, and think really carefully about who they're teaching. And when they come into the institution, when they come in and they start learning, do they understand what those disciplinary norms are? So I'm sure all of you can think back to when you first came to work in the higher education sector, or you started working in further education or in your department. Everyone talked a language that you didn't quite understand yet. There were all sorts of shortcuts, and it happens in every kind of community, whether it's 3 or 4 friends together that have known each other for a while, or whether it's a nation. There is a cultural understanding that goes with language that is impenetrable to other people. So if you have a disciplinary norm, if you have a way of speaking in your subject area, and students are coming in, and some are coming from a school that's, might have given them a big background, some might be coming from further education, some might be coming having been out of the world, in the world of work for a while and not been in education for a while, they'll have really different understandings of what the disciplinary norms are, and they might not be able to access those. So think about that. That's what it's saying to educators. Teach to nurture student belonging and engagement. If you want inclusion, you want to make sure that everyone feels part of the education process. That you're not just leaving people out accidentally by ignoring their kind of cultural background or whatever it might be. So think really carefully about who you're teaching, where they come from, what their experiences might be. If you have international students from China in your classroom, it's no good referring to the BBC Radio 4 programme that you all heard yesterday, because they probably didn't. It's no good talking about football because they might not understand the British football culture. And it's not relevant to them. So they don't feel part of your teaching. So you need to really think about that when you're setting out on teaching. Who have you got in your classroom? And really make sure that people feel belong. Anyway. Interact with diversity through learning and teaching. Diversity is vital. We heard it earlier on the sofas. The idea that students interacting with disabled students in a classroom is really important for their future development, for the world of work. Interacting with diversity in a global world is critical. So don't pretend that you're in this bubble in higher education and that's something that they deal with when they leave. Deal with it now. Raise it all through the process of teaching. Don't make it a separate thing that you have to go and learn about. Build it into your learning and teaching process. Engage with diversity. Engage with difference whilst you're teaching. And then encourage and practice self-reflection. Absolutely critical. Think about yourself, your own biases, and how those might come out in the way in which you teach. Now, these are fantastic things. I agree with Paul. I read this when I read the work that Pauline produced, and I just thought, yes, this is it. This is really good stuff. This is what academics should be doing. And this is where it gets to, for me, I start to relate to my own experience of working with academics across the institution. And what I was saying to you before about academics not being necessarily focused on learning and teaching. One of the things I say to people when I'm setting up a workshop for academics who've been working in an institution for 10 years, and they're going to use their experience to say, I know how to teach. Not only do I do all the things that I'm supposed to do, but I know how to do the things I'm supposed to do. You remember this is what I was saying about Sheffield and Eleanor. They do these things. They know their subject, yes, but they also understand how teaching and learning works. They know the methodologies around learning and teaching. They understand how students learn. They know the difference between the different levels that they might be teaching at and the sort of impacts that might have. They have to demonstrate that they know these things. And they also have to refer to the learning and teaching literature, the pedagogy, about the theory and practice of learning and teaching. So I tell them all this stuff, and then I say, don't worry. I know you don't have those books on your bookshelves, because on your bookshelves are books about graphic design or engineering or architecture or whatever it is, and the research you're doing into that. Your discipline will provide those resources, and you can go away and look at them. And when I speak to people and when I sit in conversation with people, I realize they're not... Now, I'm making a sweeping statement here because some, the ones that you probably meet and go, yes, some are, but many, many, many academics teaching in higher education do not really understand what they're doing. They've picked it up from their colleagues, and somebody said this works and that works, and this is how we do it, and this is how you should do it, and do it like this, and they've done it, and it seems to work okay, and the students are reasonably happy, but they don't understand what they're doing. They're not really engaged in learning and teaching as a profession. That's not what drives them. They didn't start out to be teachers. They started out to be something else. And that leads to, quite often, a real sense of fear. Fear of being found out. Fear of this isn't really where I should be. I'm sort of getting away with it a little. And I have that. We all have those things. I left school at 18 with rubbish results, never wanted to go near a university, never wanted to work in academia, hated the idea of academia, trained as a professional actor and worked as an actor for 10 years. Then I started doing sign language interpreting, and ever since I've thought I was a fraud. And I'm waiting for somebody to tap me on the shoulder and go, come on, you've had a good run, off you go. Okay, I'll go now. Because, it's not what I started out to do, so I sort of feel like I've slipped into it sideways. And all the time I feel like I'm working hard to try and catch up with myself. So the job that we have, the job that you have, if you're going to get these things out of people who don't really understand learning and teaching and are a little bit scared and so often dig their heels in a little or don't come to the sessions which might expose them, if you're going to reach those people, you have to understand that. And you have to be sympathetic and empathetic towards those things. Just like teachers have to understand their students, if you're going to persuade academics to change their practice, to get culture change, to change their culture that they have within higher education, then you're going to have to understand those things about them. But there's another thing that's happening as well. And the other thing that's happening is the unconscious assumptions that we all have and people have in higher education, in the UK certainly, but I wouldn't be surprised if it exists here too, about what higher education is for and what it contains and what a student looks like, what a good graduate looks like, for example. In other words, we create a box within which higher education or teaching exists, and that box, the borders of that box, the outlines of that box are built on tradition. The tradition that isn't written down anywhere. There is nothing that defines these things, but we kind of understand them. That a graduate knows how to spell and write fluently. That's what a good graduate looks like, for example. Now, that may not be taught at any time, but it might be assessed. It might not be part of the assessment rubric, but some academics will take marks off if somebody can't spell in an exam. But I know loads of people who can't spell. Doesn't matter anymore because they've got a computer that they can get all their spelling checked. And they know that they have a bit of a problem, so they ask somebody to read over it and make sure that it's okay, and they proofread it. And then they send out their report to the important people who might go, can't spell. Okay, we understand that exists. And yet in higher education, I do a little test with academics sometimes, and I ask them that question, how important is it? And I get a range of different answers in the same subject group, and what you find is academics in the same arena are marking students differently, and they don't even realize it. They don't realize what their colleagues are doing, and they don't even realize what they're doing. But because they feel that the student isn't really showing something that's kind of graduate-like, they mark them down. But it's not actually there in the rubric, so why should they? And that's a barrier. That's a barrier for many disabled students. It's a barrier for many students, full stop. There was a piece of, I'm going to stop and let some questions come now. There's some research done, absolutely unethical research, ages ago in the 60s, which basically what happened was they tested a load of young children on their ability, and the idea of the outcomes of this was supposed to reveal to them which pupils were going to do very well next year. Complete fabrication. They just made it up. But what they did do was that they then chose at random 20 pupils from each class, and told the teachers in that class that next year these 20, because of the results of this test, these 20 were expected to do very well. Totally chosen at random, and the only people that knew who those pupils were the teachers. Lo and behold, those 20 pupils did better next year, and they were completely chosen at random. So they then had to look into this. Why was this happening? And what they came up with was that teachers appear to teach more and to teach it more warmly to students for whom they have more favourable expectations. And that leads to them doing better. Completely unconscious. Not aware of doing it, not deliberately doing it, just unconsciously doing it. So these are the kinds of things that we have to get inside the minds of academics, get them to realize what they're doing and how they're doing it and what barriers they're creating through their own assumptions. And if we want true inclusion to happen, that's the way we have to kind of meet with them, because we can have all this stuff coming down from on high, but if they don't know what it is that they're doing, if they don't understand in a really deep way, what inclusion means and what it means for their practice, change isn't going to happen. It's just not going to happen, and it's why it hasn't happened. Inclusion has been around for a long time, and it hasn't happened. So, a lot to think about. I probably did talk too quickly. But thank you for listening to me. Thank you for bearing with my ranting and raving and listening to my experiences. And I hope you really enjoy the rest of the conference.